Imagine it is late afternoon in the mountains, sometime in the mid-19th century. You are a woman alone on a high ridge, perhaps with a child at your side, perhaps with only the echo of your own breath in the frozen air. The sky, once a dull grey, has thickened into a suffocating blanket of clouds, and the wind that just an hour ago was playful, carrying stray flakes like feathers, now claws at your clothes with sharp, icy fingers. Every gust feels like the warning growl of something immense that you cannot see. There are no towns nearby. The nearest settlement might be 50 miles away, cut off by snowed-in passes and silent forests. There are no neighbours to run to. There's only you, your few tools, and the knowledge passed down from older women, or scraped together through bitter experience, that if you cannot create shelter before nightfall, the mountain will claim you. Your heart beats louder than the storm, but you cannot waste energy on fear. Instead, you begin to look at the land differently. Every tree, every slope, every rock face becomes a possible wall, a possible roof, a possible shield between you and death. And as the first true waves of the blizzard sweep across the ridge, you lower your head, grip the worn handle of your axe, and set to work. For women of the high frontier, storms were never surprises. They were omens written into the very bones of the mountains, if you only knew how to read them. The air changed first, thin, sharp, and full of static. It stung the nostrils like iron. Birds vanished from the sky, leaving the forest eerily still. Horses and dogs became restless, pacing and snorting as though the storm was already pressing against their skin. These signs were not trivial. To a woman alone with children or animals to care for, they were alarms louder than any church bell. She would immediately begin to prepare, not in panic, but with the steady, resigned rhythm of someone who had lived through such nights before. Choosing a site for shelter was an art. A careless choice meant certain suffering and possibly death. A clearing looked open and easy, but the wind would cut across it with brutal force. A valley seemed sheltered, but too low, and it would flood with snow until the weight of it crushed roofs and buried doors. The safest places were often halfway up slopes where trees clustered thickly, or at the base of cliffs where rock walls could block the worst of the gale. A woman might walk in circles, scanning, calculating, her shawl whipping in the wind, until she found the one pocket of land that felt right. There, between two spruces bent like old men under their own snow. There, at the curve of a granite outcrop that broke the wind. She knew that if she could make her stand there, she might endure what the mountain was about to unleash. Once the site was chosen, the real labour began. And it was a labour that demanded not only strength, but also a deep familiarity with the forest itself. The mountain did not hand over its materials willingly. Every branch, every stone, every strip of bark had to be claimed with sweat, with aching muscles, with hands already raw from cold. The first concern was wood, always wood. Without branches, there could be no frame for the shelter, no skeleton to hold the storm at bay. A woman would tighten the scarf around her head, pull her cloak tighter across her shoulders, and heft the axe she had carried for years, the blade dulled and scarred by endless use. The sound of metal against wood rang out in the muffled air, sharp, rhythmic strikes that sent vibrations through the frozen silence. Spruce and pine were the first choice. Their branches were strong yet flexible, heavy with needles that, when layered, acted almost like shingles. Women knew by instinct which trees to cut and which to leave standing. Sometimes it was not the largest trunk that mattered, but the smaller, younger trees that bent easily under pressure. She would select them carefully, working quickly but not carelessly, for she could not afford to waste energy. The work was exhausting. Each strike of the axe bit through only a little before the blade bounced back, numbed by the sap hardened in the cold. The tree creaked and groaned before it finally leaned, cracked, and fell into the snow with a heavy sigh. Dragging it to the chosen spot was another ordeal, legs sinking knee-deep into drifts, shoulders burning under the weight, her breath steaming in desperate clouds. Yet still she pulled, step after agonizing step, knowing that every tree meant one more layer between her children and the storm. But wood alone was not enough. She needed stones as well. stones to line a fire, stones to weigh down hides, stones to absorb and release heat through the long night. She searched with eyes trained over years, prying loose flat rocks from frozen soil, rolling heavier ones with the strength of her back and hips. Her fingers grew numb, skin cracking under the icy grip of the earth, but she pressed on. Even the smallest scraps of material were precious. Bark stripped from fallen trunks could be used to block wind from creeping under the walls. Moss, gathered in handfuls, could be stuffed into gaps, sealing out drafts. If she was lucky enough to have straw or dry grass in a pack, she would guard it as jealously as gold, because it could serve as bedding or tinder when everything else was too wet to burn. Children, if they were old enough, were not spared from this work. A boy of 8 might be sent to gather pine needles in his cloak, stumbling back with a bundle as tall as himself. A girl of 10 might be ordered to carry armfuls of twigs, her teeth chattering as she piled them near the fire pit. Their small voices sometimes rose in complaint, but a mother's sharp command or a single look reminded them of the truth. Survival was not optional, and childhood in the mountains was short. By the time enough wood and stone had been gathered, her body trembled with fatigue. Her arms ached, her legs felt hollow, her throat burned with the cold. Yet the work had only begun. She would glance at the sky, now a furious swirl of white, the daylight already smothered, and know that she had only hours, maybe less, before the blizzard swallowed the land completely. It was then that the true act of building began. The gathering was only the prelude. Now came the task that separated those who merely endured the storm from those who conquered it: the raising of the frame. A woman, standing alone or with children clinging to her skirts, had to imagine the shape of safety before it existed. In her mind's eye she saw the skeleton of a hut, no more than a low lean-to perhaps, but one that could hold against the mountain's fury. She began with the strongest piece of wood, a central pole or log that could act as a spine. If fortune placed a boulder or a leaning tree nearby, she would set the pole against it, letting the land itself serve as part of the structure. This was no place for perfection. The storm did not care for beauty, only for endurance. With the spine in place, she leaned smaller branches against it, angled like the ribs of some great animal. Each one was wedged deep into the snow or against a rock, then overlapped by another until a triangular tunnel began to form. Slowly, steadily, a shape grew, crooked, uneven, but undeniably shelter. The sound of branches snapping and settling filled the air. Every so often she paused, kneeling in the snow to adjust a gap or drive a stake deeper. Her breath plumed, frosting her eyelashes until she blinked against the sting. She could feel the blizzard pressing closer, the wind snatching at her hair, as if trying to undo her work before it was finished. She worked faster. The branches thickened into a wall, the roof began to slope downward, shedding snow instead of collecting it. If she had hides or canvas, she stretched them across the frame, pulling them taut and weighting them with stones so the gale would not tear them free. If she had nothing but more branches, she wove them together, crisscrossing pine and spruce, until not even the smallest crack was left open. Inside the shelter, the air grew dim, tinted green by the needles above. She could smell the resin, sharp and earthy, a reminder that she had bent living trees into her service. On the ground, she scattered pine boughs, layering them until they formed a springy mat. This was more than comfort. It was insulation. Without it, the cold of the frozen earth would creep into her bones, leaching warmth until sleep became death. If children were with her, she called them inside now, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. They crawled into the half-finished hut, voices muffled in the thick air, while she returned to the storm again and again, hauling more branches, dragging more stones. Each time she lifted the hide or blanket that served as the doorway, the wind screamed at her, as though furious that she dared to resist it. Hours slipped past in this blur of labour. Her body moved almost without thought. Wedge, lean, cover, press, return. The rhythm was primal, like kneading dough or rocking a child, but here it was bound up with survival itself. Finally, when her arms shook too violently to lift another log, she stepped back. Before her stood a crude hut, low, lopsided, but solid. Snow already began to collect on its roof, thickening the walls and sealing the gaps. In a cruel twist, the very storm that threatened her life also strengthened the walls she had built. Inside, it was quiet, astonishingly quiet. The howling of the wind dimmed to a distant murmur. The air, though still cold, no longer cut her lungs like knives. She sat for a moment on the pine boughs, children huddled against her, and allowed herself a single deep breath. The frame was raised, the walls were holding, for now she had carved out a pocket of survival in the endless storm. But a shelter without fire was only a tomb waiting to freeze, and so, even with trembling hands and burning muscles, she knew what came next. The frame was raised, the roof was holding, and for the first time in hours there was a pocket of stillness. Yet inside that dim shelter, the cold still reigned. It pressed in from every side, creeping through the branches, seeping upward from the frozen earth. The silence, though a relief from the storm's shrieking, was almost worse. It was the silence of a tomb. Every woman of the mountains knew that without fire, shelter was nothing more than a coffin made of wood and snow. The body could endure hunger for days, thirst for a time, but cold was merciless. Cold drained strength faster than work. Cold dulled the mind, slowed the hands, and whispered sweetly of rest until rest became death. So, with hands cracked and raw, she turned to the most fragile of all tasks, making flame. She carried her tinder in a small pouch, wrapped carefully in cloth to keep it dry. It might be shreds of birch bark, soft as paper and soaked with oils that caught even the weakest spark. It might be dry moss pulled from beneath rocks months ago and stored for just such a night. Sometimes it was nothing more than slivers of cloth torn from an old garment. Whatever it was, she guarded it as fiercely as any treasure. Beside her lay the tools, a flint and steel, or, if she was fortunate, a few matches sealed in wax. But even matches were treacherous in damp weather. They snapped, fizzled, or died in the first breath of wind. Many women had learned to strike flint on steel, showering faint sparks onto the tinder, coaxing those sparks with lips cracked from the cold, praying with every breath that one would take. The children, if they were present, huddled near her knees, their eyes wide and unblinking. They knew this was no ordinary chore. This was life itself balancing on the edge of her hands. Their small breaths fogged the air as they leaned forward, waiting, hoping. The first few strikes were almost always failures. Sparks flew, glowed briefly, and vanished. The tinder darkened, singed, but did not catch. Each failure felt like a knife twisting deeper into her chest. She could hear the storm outside, pressing harder, as though mocking her effort. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the creeping numbness that dulled her fingers until even holding the steel was agony. Still, she struck again, again, again. At last, one spark lingered, a pinprick of red in the dark nest of tinder. She bent low, shielding it with her body, cupping her hands around it as if cradling a newborn child. Her breath came slow and steady, fanning the ember. It glowed brighter, then dimmed, then flared again, growing until the first thin thread of smoke curled upward. Her heart leapt, but she dared not move too quickly. She added the tiniest shred of bark, the smallest sliver of wood, feeding the ember as one feeds an infant. Too much and it would smother, too little and it would starve. The smoke thickened, turned to flame, and suddenly there it was, the dancing miracle of fire. The children gasped. Their faces glowed orange in the flickering light, their fear softening for the first time that day. The woman, though trembling with relief, knew the work was far from done. She built the fire outward carefully, layering twigs, then sticks, then logs. Each caught, each passed the flame forward like a chain of survival. Soon the hut filled with the crackle of burning wood, the sharp scent of resin, and a warmth that seemed almost impossible after the hours of bitter cold. The fire was not just heat, it was a heartbeat. It cast shadows on the walls, reminding her that she and her children were still alive, still moving, still fighting. She lined stones around it, letting them drink the heat until they glowed faintly. Later, She would wrap those stones in cloth and tuck them into the bedding, placing them at her children's feet against their bellies to keep the cold from stealing them away while they slept. But fire was also fragile. It demanded constant attention. It ate through wood greedily, never satisfied. A woman could not simply light it and rest. She had to feed it, guard it, watch it through the night. If exhaustion overcame her and the flame died, she might never bring it back again until spring thaw. So she taught her children the ritual. One would be woken to place a stick on the coals, then another a few hours later, each taking their turn in silence, knowing that this duty was sacred. The fire was their guardian spirit, and if they tended it well, it would not abandon them. Outside, the storm roared. It clawed at the walls, shrieked down the chimney hole, rattled the frame as though determined to break it. But inside, the fire burned, and the fire answered. The battle was not over, but for this night, for this hour, the balance tipped towards survival. The fire was lit, the shelter was standing, but survival was not guaranteed simply because the flames danced for a moment. No, now came the true test, the endless stretch of night, when hours became heavy stones pressing against the body and mind. Inside that small chamber of branches and hides, the air thickened quickly. The scent of pine needles mingled with wood smoke, resinous and sharp. Shadows leapt and shivered across the walls, turning each crack in the branches into a shifting mouth or claw. The children lay close, their eyes wide and glassy, the rhythm of their breathing uneven, as though they were afraid even to sleep. The woman sat cross-legged on the mat of boughs, her back curved with fatigue, but her hands never fully relaxed. One hand rested near the fire, feeding it with twigs, nudging a coal, adjusting a stone so that the heat spread more evenly. Her ears strained constantly, listening not only to the hiss of flame but to the storm's voice outside. And what a voice it had! The blizzard screamed like a living thing, 1,000 voices shrieking through the trees, wailing over the mountains, battering at the fragile roof. At times, it sounded like laughter. At other times, like a pack of wolves circling just out of sight. The branches of the shelter creaked and shifted under the assault, and every groan sent a ripple of dread through her heart. The cold found ways to creep in despite her efforts. It pressed against the soles of their feet, slid like a thief through the smallest cracks. Each gust rattled the walls and sent flurries of snow sifting down onto their hair, melting slowly against their warm scalps. They pulled the blankets tighter, their bodies pressed together until they seemed almost a single shape, one knot of humanity holding out against the white void beyond. Time moved strangely in such nights. Minutes stretched, curled back on themselves, became indistinguishable from hours. A woman might close her eyes for what felt like a moment, only to wake with a start and discover that 2 logs had burned away, leaving the fire gasping for breath. Panic would spark, too much time gone, too much wood consumed, and she would scramble to feed the flames again, her heart pounding as though she had just saved a drowning child. There were rituals to keep despair away. Some women sang softly, old hymns carried from Europe, lullabies remembered from childhood, rough folk tunes learned on wagon trails. The songs did not banish the storm, but they wove a different sound into the night, one of warmth, of memory, of connection to a world beyond the mountains. Children, lulled by the familiar rhythm of their mother's voice, would finally allow their eyes to close. Others told stories, tales of ancestors who had survived worse storms, of hunters who returned from the snow with deer slung across their shoulders, of saints who endured trials and were rewarded with peace. The stories were not always believed in the strictest sense, but belief was not the point. The point was to push back the silence, to give the mind something to cling to besides the terror of the gale. When the fire grew too bright and the smoke too heavy, she would adjust the tiny hole in the roof, careful never to widen it too much. One careless gap could invite a dagger of wind that would undo everything. Balance was the rule of the night. Not too much flame, not too little. Not too much air, not too little. Every choice mattered. And so the night unfolded, one heartbeat at a time, one crackle of firewood at a time, one sigh of wind against the walls at a time. The woman remained half awake, caught in the strange twilight state of survival, too tired to be alert, too afraid to sleep fully. Her children shifted against her, pressing their cold noses into her arms, whispering in their dreams. The storm outside raged without mercy, tearing at trees, snapping branches, piling drifts higher and higher. It wanted to erase everything, to smooth the land into silence, to bury the tiny mark of human defiance under an ocean of white. But still the fire burned, still the shelter held, still, in that fragile bubble of warmth, life clung stubbornly to the hours. And when the first faint light of dawn crept through the cracks, grey and cold, it was not a victory parade that greeted it. It was simply relief, a long, trembling breath, a loosening of shoulders, the knowledge that another night had passed and that they were still here. Dawn in the mountains did not mean rescue. It did not mean warmth. It meant only that the sky had turned a paler shade of grey, and that the fire inside the shelter must be fed again. The storm was still there, waiting, hammering against the roof with renewed strength. Some storms lasted a night, but others seemed endless. They rolled on for 2 days, 3, sometimes more than a week. These were the storms that tested not only the body but the mind, grinding both into submission with their unrelenting weight. Inside the shelter, time lost all meaning. The woman and her children, or sometimes the woman alone, existed in a kind of suspended state, marked only by the rhythm of feeding the fire. Every log consumed was like an hourglass running out of sand. The pile of gathered wood grew smaller with each passing hour, and the question loomed, would it last long enough? Food, too, became a cruel calculation. At first, there might be dried beans, jerky, or hard bread carried in from the cabin, but as the days wore on, the meals shrank. Broth made from bones saved for emergencies. A handful of pine nuts gathered in better weather. A little melted snow stirred with whatever was left of flour. Hunger gnawed like an invisible animal, and yet it was always balanced against the greater enemy, cold. Children asked when the storm would end. She had no answer. Sometimes she told them tomorrow. Sometimes she told them soon. Other times she simply stroked their hair and said nothing at all because false hope was as dangerous as despair. The hours of darkness blurred into hours of daylight, and both looked the same, white walls of snow outside, flickering shadows inside. Sleep was fragmented. She dozed only in small bursts, waking at every crack of ice, every gust of wind that shook the shelter. Her dreams were feverish, visions of sunlight, of green grass, of a hearth in some faraway cabin, and always, when she woke, the storm was still there, howling as if it had never paused. The body began to change under such pressure. Fingers grew swollen, the skin split at the knuckles. Toes tingled, then numbed, wrapped in cloth and pressed close to hot stones. Every muscle ached from the constant effort of bending, lifting, feeding, adjusting. Even her hair froze where moisture seeped into it, stiff strands snapping when she ran her hands through them. Yet the mind, though exhausted, remained sharp in its focus on survival. She counted the wood. She rationed the food. She checked the roof for sagging snow, beating it from the inside with a stick to keep it from collapsing. She kept the children moving when they became too still, forcing them to stamp their feet, clap their hands, sing little songs to keep the blood flowing. She knew that stillness was dangerous. Stillness was surrender. Sometimes she spoke aloud, though no one was listening, to the fire, thanking it for holding, to the storm, cursing it like an enemy soldier, to God, pleading, bargaining, promising. The words filled the air, and in their own way they kept her tethered to the world of the living. And then there was the silence, the strange, eerie silence that came between gusts, when for a heartbeat the storm seemed to draw a long breath. In those moments she would listen, hoping it was the end. But then, without fail, the gale would return, louder than before, slamming into the walls with renewed force. The days blurred, hunger sharpened, fatigue deepened, yet still she endured. Each hour was a small victory, each ember coaxed back into flame a triumph. because that was how survival worked in the mountains. Not through great victories, not through sudden miracles, but through the stubborn, unyielding choice to keep breathing, to keep moving, to keep fighting the storm, one handful of twigs, one spark of fire, one heartbeat at a time. When the storm finally broke, it did not announce its departure with fanfare. There was no sudden burst of sunlight, no dramatic curtain of clouds rolling back. It ended the way it had begun, slowly, subtly, like a beast that had grown tired of its own fury and slunk away into the forest. Inside the shelter, the woman noticed it first, not with her ears, but with her breath. The air no longer vibrated with the constant howl of wind. The walls, which had trembled under each gust, grew still. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, that it startled her awake. For a moment, she feared it was death, that her heart had stopped, that the world had ended, leaving only this hollow quiet. She pushed back the flap of hide or blanket that served as the doorway, and the sight that greeted her was otherworldly. The mountains had changed. Where once there had been dark ridges and forests, there was now only white so complete it erased every familiar line, every trail, every tree trunk buried under the weight of snow. The landscape looked as though the earth itself had been reborn into a blank page, waiting to be written upon. The air was sharp, still, and brittle with cold. Each breath crystallized instantly, hanging in front of her face like fragile glass. The sky above was pale, washed out, almost indistinguishable from the snow below. In that strange twilight, it was difficult to tell where the ground ended and the heavens began. The shelter she had built was half buried, its roof sagging under layers of snow. The entrance was a narrow tunnel she had to claw through with numb fingers, digging like an animal to free herself. She could hear the crunch of the frozen crust breaking beneath her hands, the hiss of powder sliding into the small cavity behind her. When she finally stood outside, she felt small, dwarfed by the drifts piled taller than her head, dwarfed by the silence that wrapped the world like a shroud. Not a bird moved, not a branch stirred. The storm had scoured life from the surface, leaving only frozen monuments where trees and cabins once stood. The children, if she had them, followed her out, their eyes wide, their cheeks raw with frost. They blinked into the whiteness, clutching at her skirts, frightened not by the storm's roar anymore, but by its absence. Even the silence seemed threatening, as though the snow itself was listening. They moved carefully across the new world. Each step plunged deep into drifts, each movement slow and deliberate. A familiar cabin might be hidden entirely, only its chimney poking out of a snowbank. Paths that once led to streams or neighbouring homesteads were gone, erased as cleanly as if they had never existed. Food and fuel became the next concern. The woodpile, if it survived, was buried and frozen. The few caches of food she had hidden outside were lost beneath feet of snow. She had to dig, scrape, search with numb hands, guided more by memory than by sight. Every discovery, a frozen sack of beans, a bundle of kindling, even a lost tool, felt like treasure pulled from the belly of the earth. There was no celebration when the storm ended, no laughter, no cheering, only quiet relief, measured in the steady rhythm of breath, in the way her shoulders loosened after days of tension. She did not think of victory. She thought only of endurance, because the end of one storm was never truly the end. In the mountains, winter came in waves. The blizzard might lift today, but another could gather tomorrow, or the next day, or the next week. Survival was not a single triumph, but a series of them, strung together like beads on a frayed string. Still, in that moment, standing among the silent white hills, she allowed herself one small indulgence. She closed her eyes, raised her face to the pale light, and inhaled deeply. The air, though sharp and cruel, was also clean. It carried the promise, however faint, that she had outlasted the storm. And sometimes that promise was enough. Enduring a blizzard was never just about wood or fire or food. The cold gnawed at the body, yes, but it also gnawed at the mind. It whispered in quiet, persistent ways, wearing down the spirit like water-carving stone. For mountain women, survival meant learning not only how to build a shelter, but how to hold on to themselves inside it. The first enemy was silence. After the storm, when the wind at last went still, the quiet was so total that it pressed against the ears until it seemed deafening. Imagine sitting alone in a hut buried in snow, with nothing but the crackle of fire and the rasp of your own breath. Hours passed with no voices, no distant hammering of neighbours, no bells, no footsteps, nothing. Women sometimes describe the silence as a second storm, one that came from inside rather than outside. To break that silence, they spoke. They spoke to children, to animals, to themselves. Some recited prayers out loud for hours at a time, turning the rosary or repeating the psalms until the words became rhythm, heartbeat, anchor. Others sang old folk songs, filling the hut with sound not for joy but for proof that they still existed. Even a muttered monologue, scolding the fire, thanking the walls, cursing the cold, was enough to remind them that their voices still mattered. The second enemy was fear. Storms bred a kind of creeping terror, not the sudden shock of battle, but the slow dread of being erased. Every gust of wind raised the question, would the roof collapse? Would the fire die? Would the snow block the air until the shelter became a tomb? Fear was constant company, lying down beside them at night, rising with them each morning. It had to be managed like any other chore, or it would consume them. Women developed rituals for this too. Some drew crosses in the ash of the fire each morning. Some left a tiny scrap of food near the doorway, an offering to whatever spirits or saints might be listening. Others carried talismans, bits of cloth from their mother's dresses, a lock of hair, a small book of scripture, objects that gave shape to faith in a world where faith was often all they had. The third enemy was despair. Hunger could be borne. Cold could be fought. But despair hollowed out the will to fight. Days of storm, weeks of isolation, could twist the mind into believing that nothing beyond the snow still existed. Letters from family, churches, marketplaces, laughter, fields of green, all seemed like fading dreams. To counter this, women clung to memory and imagination. Around the fire they told children's stories, not just Bible tales or folk tales, but memories of home, of warm kitchens, of apple harvests, of rivers running clear in summer. These stories were as much for themselves as for the little ones. Speaking the memory aloud kept it alive, kept it from being swallowed by the white silence. Some even kept journals, scratching words into scraps of paper, recording each day of the storm. The act of writing, even if no one else would ever read it, anchored them. It gave the endless white void a timeline, a sequence, a narrative. And yet, for all the hardship, the storms also forged resilience. A woman who endured one blizzard knew she could endure another. A mother who kept her children alive through 3 nights of hunger and cold carried that triumph forever. In the stillness that followed, she might weep, she might pray, but she also knew, deep down, that she had faced the mountain and had not broken. The toll was real. Many aged before their time, faces lined with worry, hands twisted with frostbite or arthritis. Some carried the quiet of those winters with them forever, speaking little, staring into fires as if they still listened for the howl of the wind. But others emerged hardened, like tempered steel, silent proof that survival was as much a work of the soul as of the body. In the end, the blizzards were more than storms. They were teachers, cruel and merciless, but teachers all the same. They taught that survival was not strength alone, but patience, not courage alone, but stubbornness, and that sometimes the greatest victory was not in conquering the mountain, but in simply enduring it. Though storms often forced women into solitude, survival in the mountains was never truly an individual act. Behind every shelter raised against the blizzard stood a long line of shared memory. Techniques passed from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, whispered at kitchen tables, around hearths, or during brief meetings in market towns before the snows closed in. When women gathered, they spoke of storms the way sailors speak of the sea, with respect, with fear, and with a quiet pride. They compared notes, traded warnings, taught one another tricks that might one day mean the difference between life and death. The passing of knowledge. One woman might demonstrate how to weave pine boughs tightly so that snow layered on them would not fall through. Another might describe the best way to bank a fire with ash, keeping coals alive through the night without wasting precious wood. Still another would explain how to melt snow without scorching the pot, or how to store tinder inside a leather pouch against the body so it never grew damp. These details, so small, so ordinary, were in fact lifelines. Each lesson was a thread in the invisible web of community that stretched across valleys and ridges. A girl who watched her grandmother stuff moss into cracks might recall that moment years later when she crouched alone in a hut, repeating the same gesture with her own shaking hands. Knowledge was rarely written. It was spoken, shown, repeated in rhythm with chores. The memory of survival lived in the body, in the way hands folded a blanket against a doorframe, in the way eyes scanned the horizon for a change in cloud colour, in the way a mother's voice tightened when she warned her children to never, ever let the fire die. Mutual aid in small settlements. In the scattered settlements of the frontier, women leaned on one another when the storms broke. If a cabin's roof collapsed, neighbours might dig through drifts together, hauling survivors into another home. If one family's food ran out, another might share beans or flour, knowing that in another year the favour might be returned. There are accounts of women walking miles through snow to check on widows or elders, carrying bundles of firewood on their backs. They did this not because they had surplus strength, they were exhausted themselves, but because they understood a truth the mountains made clear: no one survived alone forever. Stories as survival tools. When storms ended, women told stories, not simply to pass the time, but to pass along warnings. Children grew up hearing about the blizzard of such and such a year, when the snow buried cabins up to the chimneys, or the time when someone forgot to leave an air hole in the roof and nearly suffocated. These tales, repeated around firesides, were not exaggerations for drama's sake. They were instruction manuals disguised as memory. A child who shivered while listening might one day find himself or herself in the same peril, and those words would return like echoes. Always keep the fire fed. Always bank the roof. Always listen to the wind. The invisible sisterhood. Though history often speaks of rugged mountain men, the truth was that mountain women formed their own kind of silent sisterhood. Most never met beyond the bounds of their valleys. Many never knew one another's names, yet each carried fragments of the same wisdom, and each added to it in her own way. This unspoken bond stretched across generations. A girl who learned from her mother how to bind her hands in rags before chopping frozen wood might teach the same trick to her granddaughter 50 years later. And though storms came and went, that line of teaching never broke, because it was carved into survival itself. In the end, community in the mountains was not only about physical gatherings, but about memory, about women whispering to one another across time, passing on the knowledge of storms like a flame carried carefully from one hand to another. Legends, faith, and superstition. Survival in the mountains was not only a contest of muscle and material, it was also a battle of the spirit, and mountain women understood this perhaps better than anyone. When storms howled against the walls, when the fire seemed fragile as a candle against the ocean of cold, many turned to something deeper: faith, superstition, the old half-remembered legends that gave shape to fear and hope alike. Faith as shelter. For some, the Bible was as essential as the axe or the flint. A worn, leather-bound book sat close to the fire, its pages wrinkled from steam, its words read aloud to children in the dim orange glow. Verses became more than scripture. They became incantations, protective charms. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Whispered not for recitation's sake, but as a shield against the blizzard pressing in from all sides. Crosses were traced in the ash at dawn, little marks of defiance smudged onto the shelter's floor or walls. Women believed these simple gestures could keep the roof from collapsing, or at least remind them that God's eye lingered even in the remotest valley. The old superstitions. But not all protection came from church pews and scripture. Many carried fragments of older beliefs, bits of folk wisdom carried across oceans from Europe or borrowed from the native peoples, whose knowledge of the mountains stretched back generations. Some believed that hanging a sprig of evergreen above the doorway would ward off spirits that roamed with the snow. Others swore that tossing a pinch of salt into the fire kept death itself from stepping through the threshold. Children were warned never to whistle during a storm, for it was said to call the wind inside. One superstition told of the White Widow, a spirit of the blizzard, a woman draped in snow who walked the ridges searching for lost souls. If you heard her voice in the wind, you must never answer, for she would lead you out into the storm and bury you beneath the drifts. Mothers whispered this tale to keep children from wandering too close to the door at night, but even grown women felt a chill when the gale howled like a weeping woman. Charms and talismans. Objects, too, carried power. A locket holding a curl of hair from a lost child, a strip of cloth sewn secretly into a dress, a bead carved from bone worn on a string around the neck. These were not decorations. They were anchors, reminders that the storm could not strip away identity or memory. Some stitched tiny symbols into clothing, stars, crosses or runes barely visible in the seams. Others carried a stone from the river, polished smooth by water, believing it held warmth that would never die. To an outsider, these might seem like trifles, but in the frozen hours of a blizzard, when every sound could be the roof breaking, when every gust threatened to smother the fire, such objects steadied the heart, and in the mountains a steady heart was as necessary as steady hands. The blending of beliefs. What is most striking is how faith and superstition often intertwined. A woman might pray the Lord's Prayer while also leaving an offering of bread at the threshold. She might sing a hymn while tying an amulet of bone and feather above the doorway. There was no contradiction in this. In the face of storms, all forms of protection were welcome. This blending of the sacred and the folk created a unique spiritual culture, half Christian, half ancestral, entirely practical. Women were not theologians debating doctrine. They were survivors gathering every weapon they could against a merciless season. The role of stories. And always, stories carried belief further than ritual alone. After the storm, neighbours would gather and tell of the blizzard that nearly swallowed them, or the night when strange lights danced above the mountains, or the time when a voice in the wind seemed to guide a woman to safety. These stories grew, changed, became legends in their own right. For the children who listened, they were not mere entertainments. They were lessons in disguise. Respect the storm, guard the fire, trust in what cannot be seen. In this way, mountain women lived between the material and the mystical. Their shelters were built of wood and stone, but their strength was built of prayer and story, of symbols traced in ash and whispers carried into the night. When the storms finally loosened their grip and the weight of snow stopped falling from the sky, there was no triumphant awakening, no sudden change from death to life, but rather a slow unfolding, like the weary lifting of a curtain after a long and merciless play. The days grew longer almost without notice, a few minutes added to the light here and there, and women would push aside the flap of their shelters to find that the world was not quite as white, not quite as suffocating as it had been the day before. The snow was still deep, but the sun lingered on it longer now, glazing it with a sheen that hinted at melting, and water trickled in fine threads down the rocks where ice had once clung like iron. For women who had spent weeks huddled in the half-dark, breathing smoke, rationing food and listening to the constant moan of wind, this change was almost dizzying, almost unbelievable, as though the mountains had finally taken pity and were allowing them to breathe again. Yet the thaw was not relief alone, for it brought its own kind of labour, its own new battle. Snowdrifts collapsed into sudden floods, roofs sagged and shed their icy burdens, paths turned to rivers of mud that swallowed boots to the ankle. The shelters that had saved their lives often rotted before their eyes, their walls softening, their branches falling apart in dripping heaps. A woman who had relied on that fragile hut with all the faith of her heart would step outside to see it disintegrate in the sun. and she was reminded that nothing built in desperation was meant to last forever. So she dismantled what remained, dragging the wood aside, stacking what was still solid, burning the rest, for nothing in the mountains could ever be wasted. The children, restless from long confinement, ran out into the thaw with shrill laughter, breaking through the crust of snow, splashing through the water, their cheeks red not from frost this time, but from the excitement of movement. Their mothers watched them carefully, half smiling and half anxious, for they knew the danger was not gone. A warm day could be followed by another storm, and food was still thin, and fever often followed the dampness of the thaw. But still, for a moment, they allowed themselves to listen to that laughter, and to feel that spring, though fragile, though uncertain, was coming. Inside their bodies the winter remained. Their hands bore scars from frost and work, their backs carried the weight of sleepless nights, their minds carried the heavy shadows of silence and fear. Some never shook it. They lived the rest of their years glancing at the horizon when clouds gathered, tightening their grip on the axe whenever the wind picked up, hoarding dry tinder with almost religious devotion. Others, strangely enough, grew harder and calmer, as though once they had endured a storm that threatened to erase them, nothing else in life could strike quite so deeply. And, in the telling of stories around spring fires, the memories of those blizzards became more than private suffering. They became threads woven into the collective fabric of community. Neighbours compared their trials. Women spoke of how their shelters nearly collapsed, how the fire almost died, how a single ember or a single sturdy branch had saved a life. Children listened wide-eyed, and though they laughed at the more frightening details, they were learning, absorbing quietly the lessons that might one day keep them alive when they themselves faced the mountain's fury. The women knew this, and they told the stories not just for catharsis, not just to release the weight in their own chests, but to prepare those who came after them. Spring did not erase winter, it revealed its cost. Graves appeared as snow receded, sometimes marked, sometimes forgotten, sometimes nothing more than a patch of earth where a cabin had failed to hold. Those who survived walked among them with a sober recognition that survival had never been guaranteed, that every year the mountains claimed their toll. Yet in that same recognition lived a quiet pride, for each breath they took in the warming air, each step into muddy thaw, each seed planted into soil still half frozen, was proof that they had endured once more, that the storm had not been the end, but only another chapter in the endless cycle of struggle and renewal that defined life in the high country. Would you like me to keep carrying the narration further, following these women as spring deepens into summer, and showing how the memory of blizzards haunted and shaped the rhythms of their daily lives, even in times of warmth? When spring finally deepened and the days grew longer, women did not forget the storms. They carried them in their bones like an unshakable memory. Each task of the warmer months was shaped by what they had endured. When they stacked wood in summer, they stacked it higher than reason required, because they remembered the hunger of the fire on those endless nights. When they gathered herbs and dried food, they did so with a seriousness that came not from thrift alone, but from the image of a child staring at an empty pot while the blizzard howled outside. Even the smallest chores, the mending of clothes, the patching of roofs, the tightening of door frames, were infused with the ghost of winter, for they knew that the cold would return, and that every stitch made in July might be the thread that saved a life in January. The rhythm of life in the mountains was never free from that awareness. A sunny afternoon could be enjoyed, but beneath the laughter lay the knowledge that another storm would come, perhaps stronger, perhaps longer, perhaps with less food and less fuel to meet it. And yet, rather than drowning in fear, the women of the mountains turned this knowledge into resilience. They told their children stories not only of blizzards, but of how they had endured them, how the fire had held, how the shelter had stood, how their voices had sung against the wind. These were not tales of despair, but of endurance, meant to remind the next generation that while the storms were merciless, people could be more stubborn still. And in this way, the memory of blizzards became part of their character, part of the very culture of the mountains. Faith, superstition, skill, patience. All of it was braided together into a single truth, that survival was not a matter of conquering the storm, but of standing through it, waiting it out, believing that dawn would come again no matter how dark the night. And so the story closes not with a single woman, nor a single storm, but with the countless women who, through centuries, faced the same bitter winds and the same white silence. They did not build monuments. Their names were not carved into stone. Their shelters vanished with the thaw. Their footprints disappeared beneath the melt, and history rarely wrote their deeds in books. Yet every family that lived on in the mountains owed its existence to them, to the women who cut branches with bleeding hands, who guarded fragile fires through endless nights, who pressed their children close and whispered prayers into the roar of the gale. Their legacy is not in the shelters themselves, which were temporary and crude, but in the spirit they carried forward. It is in the patience to endure what cannot be fought, in the quiet courage to face a storm without certainty, in the unyielding care that built life out of hardship. Long after the blizzards passed, long after the snow melted and the valleys bloomed with green, that spirit remained, woven into the stories, into the customs, into the very soil of the mountains. And if you listen closely even today, when the wind rises suddenly among the pines, you might still hear an echo of their endurance, a faint reminder that once, long ago, mountain women built shelters against deadly blizzard. Tonight, before you drift off to sleep, I want you to imagine a world where the night sky is wide and endless, where the stars glimmer above fields that stretch so far you cannot see where they end, and where the silence of the dark is broken only by the low rustle of cotton plants swaying in a humid breeze. It is the American South sometime in the first half of the 19th century, though the exact year hardly matters, because time here moves not in days or seasons, but in endless cycles of work, pain, and control. In this world, you are not free to decide who you are. You are not free to choose who you love. Even the simplest human feelings, soft glances, small touches, moments of laughter shared in secret, are dangerous, because you are enslaved, and your body does not belong to you. It belongs to someone else. Someone who sees you not as a person but as property, and who will decide, without hesitation, whether you may live, or whether you must suffer, or whether you must die. And in this place, love between two men, or between two women, is not merely frowned upon. It is not a secret shame to be whispered about, or a private scandal to be hidden behind curtains. It is treated as rebellion. It is punished as defiance. It is a threat to the order of slavery itself. Because when every part of your life is supposed to serve the master's profit, to step outside that expectation, even with something as fragile, as natural as love, is to risk everything. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let yourself sink into the rhythm of history, we are going to walk slowly through that dangerous landscape. We will step into the fields at dawn, where the overseer's whip cracks the air sharper than any bird's song. We will slip into the crowded slave quarters at night, where people huddle together for warmth and comfort, and where sometimes tenderness blooms in the shadows. And we will see how that tenderness, something the rest of the world might call simple affection, was turned by the machinery of slavery into something punishable by death. Because here, in the South of long ago, love itself could be a crime, and being gay, as a slave, was not simply forbidden, it was a death sentence. When the first light of morning creeps over the horizon, it does not arrive as a gentle invitation to wakefulness, but as a command, sharp and unrelenting, calling every enslaved body into motion. The fields stretch endlessly, white with cotton blossoms or dark with tobacco leaves, a landscape that might look peaceful from a distance, but up close it is a prison without walls, a place where every breath, every gesture, every fleeting moment of rest belongs to someone else. The master, often spoken of as a man of refinement, a gentleman of the South, sits high above this world, his wealth built on the backs of the enslaved, his comfort carved from their exhaustion. Beneath him, the overseers prowl like wolves, carrying whips, rifles, and the authority to punish without hesitation. And at the bottom, scattered across the fields and the quarters, are the people whose lives are bound together, not by choice, but by chains, men and women who bend and stoop from dawn to dusk, who endure hunger, heat, and humiliation, and who, despite everything, still carry within them the fragile pulse of humanity. In this rigid hierarchy, nothing is truly private. Your work is measured, your body inspected, your words overheard, your relationships scrutinized. Even marriage exists only when it serves the master's interests, a union permitted not for love, but for the promise of children. Children who will themselves be counted as property, future workers in the endless machine. And so, affection is carefully policed, a smile held too long, a touch that lingers past what is acceptable, a stolen moment in the shadows of the quarters. These are not merely acts of tenderness, they are risks, gambles made under the gaze of men who believe love itself must be useful, profitable, and controlled. For the enslaved, the stakes are unthinkably high. To love someone the master does not approve of is already dangerous. But to love someone of the same sex is to step entirely outside the logic of slavery, to refuse the role of breeder, to deny the endless cycle of forced reproduction, to claim a piece of yourself that the master cannot own. And that act of claiming, that refusal to fit neatly into the system, is treated as rebellion. The punishments are designed not just to hurt, but to terrify. A lashing so brutal it tears skin from flesh. A branding seared into a shoulder or a thigh, marking the body forever as an example. And in the harshest, most merciless cases, a public execution, hung from a tree, shot at dawn, or burned before the gathered eyes of the community. The message unmistakable. This is what happens when you love outside the lines we have drawn for you. And yet, despite the fear, despite the cruelty, despite the certainty of punishment, love still stirs in the hearts of the enslaved. It stirs in glances exchanged at dusk when the day's labour is finally over. It stirs in whispered songs, sung low so the overseer cannot hear. It stirs in hidden corners where two people might sit close enough that their hands brush together just for a moment before pulling apart. It stirs, fragile and defiant, like a flame hidden in the dark, always under threat, but never completely extinguished. When the day finally gives way to night, the fields fall silent, and the air, though still heavy with heat, carries the faint coolness of darkness. The enslaved return to the quarters, rows of rough wooden cabins, built not for comfort, but for containment, their walls thin, their roofs leaking, their floors nothing more than packed dirt, worn smooth by restless feet. Inside, families crowd together, sometimes 5, sometimes 10 or more, crammed into a space smaller than a single room in the master's house, their only possessions perhaps a blanket, a few cooking pots, and the aching weariness of their own bodies. Here in the shadows, away from the relentless eye of the overseer, something fragile dares to emerge, the whisper of a lullaby sung to a child, the murmur of a prayer offered to the night sky through the cracks in the roof, the quiet rhythm of two people leaning against each other, sharing not words but warmth, because words can betray, but closeness, even fleeting closeness, can keep a soul alive. For men and women who were denied ownership of their time, their labour, their futures, the night time was the only space where they could try, however briefly, to reclaim themselves. And it was in these spaces, dimly lit by a dying fire, filled with the smell of smoke and sweat, that forbidden loves took root. Two men, finding in each other not only desire, but recognition, a reminder that they were more than the work they performed. Two women whose hands brushed while gathering kindling, who lingered a little too long when braiding each other's hair, who dared, in the privacy of night, to share a kiss meant for no one but themselves. But always, above these moments, hung the shadow of discovery, a neighbour who whispered, a child who spoke too freely, an overseer who entered without warning, his eyes trained to spot not only laziness in the fields, but tenderness in the dark. And once suspicion was raised, mercy was almost never given. For the enslaved, love between two men or two women was branded not simply as sin, but as defiance of the master's authority, a waste of bodies that were meant to reproduce, and, most dangerously, a sign that enslaved people carried within them a life of their own, unshaped by the chains that bound them. To allow such love was, in the mind of the enslavers, to loosen control, to risk rebellion, to acknowledge that enslaved people were human in ways that could not be caged. And so, the punishment was designed to destroy not only the body but also the memory of tenderness. Public whippings where lovers were forced to watch each other bleed, executions carried out at dawn, with the entire community compelled to witness, so that fear would sink deeper than hope. The message was clear. Affection was not yours to give, love was not yours to claim. Your very heart belonged to the master, and if it strayed, it would be crushed. And yet, like the faint ember of a dying fire, love continued to glow against all odds. Because even in the darkest cabins, even under the heaviest shadow, the human heart, stubborn and fragile, could not be fully silenced. There comes a night when the secret cannot hold any longer, when a glance lingers too openly, when a hand reaches too far, or when a whisper, meant only for the darkness, finds its way to the ears of someone willing to trade silence for favor. And in that moment, what had been a fragile ember of comfort becomes the spark that summons violence. The overseer does not need much proof. A rumor is enough, a sighting in the shadows, or even the suspicion that two people already worn thin from endless labor have found something tender in each other's presence. And once suspicion hardens into accusation, there is little hope of escape. The punishment rarely takes place in private. It is drawn out into the daylight, staged like a ritual, so that everyone, every man, every woman, every child, will carry the memory in their bones. The enslaved are gathered in the clearing, the morning air still cool, though hearts beat heavy and afraid. Children cling to their mothers, men lower their eyes, not daring to watch too directly, yet unable to turn away. And in the center, those accused stand, trembling, already broken by the knowledge of what is to come. The whip cracks first. Its sound alone is meant to slice through the crowd, to carve fear deeper than flesh. The overseer shouts words about sin, about shame, about defiance, though the words themselves matter less than the spectacle of power being performed. The lash falls again and again until the skin gives way, until the body shudders, until blood stains the dust beneath their feet. Sometimes the punishment ends there, with scars that never heal, with pain that lingers every time the back bends in the fields. But often, for those whose crime is not merely laziness or defiance, but the daring of love itself, the whip is only the beginning. A rope is thrown over the branch of a tree. The noose dangles in the morning light, simple and merciless. The condemned is forced to climb onto a stool or a wagon, and in that long, unbearable moment before the ground falls away, their eyes search the crowd. Perhaps they find the face of the one they loved, already beaten, already broken, forced to watch as the lesson is carved into memory. Perhaps they find only the faces of their brothers and sisters, eyes full of tears they cannot shed aloud. And then the stool is kicked, the body falls, and the silence that follows is heavier than any shout. The overseer calls it justice, the master calls it order, but for the enslaved who watch, it is something else entirely. A reminder that even the most human of feelings, love, tenderness, longing, has been twisted into a crime punishable by death. A reminder that their hearts are not free, that even the act of caring for one another is claimed by the same system that demands their labor, their sweat, their very lives. And yet, when the body is cut down, when the crowd is sent back to the fields, when night falls once more and the cabins fill with whispers and quiet sobs, something survives. Because memory cannot be whipped away, because longing cannot be buried in silence. And even though terror rules the day, the night still carries the faint, impossible hope that one heart can reach another, even in chains. When the punishments ended and the crowd was sent back to the fields, when the overseer's whip was coiled and the rope was left swaying in the wind, it might have seemed, to those who held power, that the lesson had been learned, that fear had erased the possibility of love, that silence had won. But silence, though heavy, is never complete. In the cabins at night, When the embers of the fire glowed faintly in the dark, voices would rise in songs that carried more meaning than the words revealed. The spirituals, those haunting melodies that seemed to speak of heaven, of freedom, of deliverance, often held hidden messages, threads of defiance woven into hymns, and sometimes, buried deep in those words, was a memory of someone lost, of someone loved, of someone who dared to hold another too closely and paid the price. It was never spoken directly, but the community remembered, and memory itself became resistance. Children, too, learned these lessons, not from books, not from sermons, but from the whispers of their elders. A story told in fragments. Don't linger too long, don't let your feelings show, the master will notice, the overseer will punish. And yet, in the same breath, the story carried something else. They loved, and we remember them. In a world that tried to erase every trace of humanity, remembering became an act of defiance, a way of insisting that these lives and these loves had meaning. Even after abolition, when slavery was legally ended, but oppression found new forms, through segregation, through violence, through the long shadow of racism, the memory of forbidden love in the quarters did not vanish. It survived in the hidden language of the oppressed, in the coded glances of those who still feared discovery, in the fragile networks of trust that carried whispers from one generation to the next. And so, though history books rarely spoke of it, though official records almost never admitted it, the truth lingered. That among the enslaved were men who loved men, women who loved women, and people whose very existence defied the cruel categories imposed upon them. They loved in darkness, they loved in silence, they loved knowing that discovery meant ruin, yet still they loved. In the end, the greatest act of rebellion was not escape, not open revolt, not even survival itself, but the simple, stubborn persistence of the human heart refusing to be owned. Because the master could command the body, could demand the labor, could punish the defiance, but he could never truly extinguish the quiet fire that flickered between two people who dared, even for a moment, to belong to one another. And in that fire, in that faint glow that passed from one hidden story to the next, lay a truth too deep to be silenced. That love, no matter how forbidden, always finds a way to survive. The days on the plantation did not pass as ordinary days do, marked by clocks or calendars, by seasons celebrated with freedom, by moments of leisure freely chosen. Instead, they flowed into one another like an endless chain, each link forged from exhaustion, repetition, and the careful monitoring of those who owned both land and lives. Morning arrived not as a gentle beginning, but as an order. The overseer's voice, the sharp crack of the whip against the air, the ringing of a bell that did not invite but commanded. The enslaved rose from the cramped cabins, their bodies already aching from the day before, their stomachs rarely full, their minds heavy with thoughts they dared not voice. The men, women, and children shuffled into lines, tools in their hands, eyes cast down, not because humility came naturally, but because a single glance in the wrong direction could summon suspicion, and suspicion, on a plantation, was enough to bring pain. The fields themselves were vast, stretching farther than the eye could follow, a sea of cotton under the burning sun, a landscape that might appear beautiful to someone who had never bent within it. But for those who worked there, the white blossoms were not flowers but shackles, each one needing to be picked with aching fingers until the skin split and bled. The rhythm was relentless. Bend, pluck, straighten, move forward, again and again, until the hours blurred and the horizon seemed not to move at all. The overseers patrolled between the rows, their presence felt even before they were seen, the weight of their gaze heavier than the baskets on weary backs. They carried whips, not always used, but always visible, reminders that discipline was never more than a heartbeat away. Some carried rifles, others dogs, and all carried the authority to decide in an instant whether a man or woman had worked hard enough to deserve to live without punishment for one more day. Meals, when they came, were small, coarse, and eaten quickly, little more than what was necessary to keep bodies moving until dusk. Water was warm and often scarce. Rest was not rest, but a pause, quickly ended by another shout, another order, another demand that the endless work continue. And yet, within this rigid cycle, people found ways, tiny, almost invisible ways, to hold on to fragments of themselves. A joke whispered between rows of cotton, barely audible, but enough to spark a flicker of laughter that eased the burden, if only for a moment. A song, rising low and steady, disguised as a work chant, but carrying meanings hidden from the ears of the overseer, messages of sorrow, of longing, of hope. A glance, exchanged in passing, so brief it could be missed by anyone watching, but carrying more warmth than hours of rest could provide. For those who felt the pull of forbidden love, each day was an unbroken test of silence. A smile had to be shortened, a touch had to be disguised as accident. A word had to be spoken as if it were meant for all, not only for one. And though the fields were crowded, with hundreds bent in labour, there was no privacy, no corner where a secret could live without risk, no shadow deep enough to hide from the eyes of those who watched for any trace of rebellion. Even in the harsh monotony of the plantation, life pulsed quietly. Children played, even in hunger. Mothers hummed songs taught by their mothers before them. Men carved small tokens from wood in the briefest pauses between tasks, tokens that carried no value to the master, but immense meaning to those who received them. And among these fragile expressions of humanity, love sometimes took root, dangerous and delicate, growing in soil where survival itself was a daily act of resistance. The days were endless, yes, but within them were moments, fleeting and precious, that reminded the enslaved that they were not only bodies bound to labour, but souls who could still feel, still hope, and still long for something beyond the horizon that seemed so far away. In a world where every movement was observed, where every sound was measured, where even the rhythm of breathing at night could be interrupted by the sudden creak of the overseer's boots outside the cabin, love could not appear in grand gestures. It did not arrive with flowers or letters written in secret ink or dances beneath the open sky. It lived instead in glances that lasted half a heartbeat longer than they should, in the gentle brush of hands that met over a shared task, in the stolen moment of laughter that was swallowed as quickly as it escaped. For two men, the bond might begin in the fields, where hours of labour bent them shoulder to shoulder, where a word spoken softly could pass unnoticed by the overseer, but not by the one it was meant for. Exhaustion created a strange intimacy, one man lifting another's basket when the weight became too much, one leaning against the other as dusk fell and strength gave way to trembling legs. Affection could grow out of necessity, out of survival, out of the small mercies they offered each other in a world that offered none. For two women, the connection might spark in the shared tasks of evening, gathering water, washing clothes, tending fires that kept children warm. The simple act of braiding hair became a ritual of trust, fingers lingering gently, whispers exchanged while the rest of the cabin drifted towards sleep. It was a comfort that went beyond survival, a reminder that within their bodies too often reduced to tools for bearing children, there still lived desire, choice, tenderness. Every gesture was wrapped in risk. An overseer who entered without warning, his suspicion sharpened by years of watching for weakness. A neighbour, too frightened to remain silent, who spoke to save themselves, and in doing so condemned another. Even a child, innocent in intention, could ruin everything with a careless word repeated in the wrong company. And so, love had to be encoded, hidden beneath layers of ordinary behaviour. A glance disguised as a glance toward the fire, a smile offered as if it were meant for everyone, a hand brushing against another in the shadows, withdrawn before anyone else could see. It was a language without words, written in fragments of time, preserved in memory rather than spoken aloud. For those who risked it, the sweetness was sharpened by danger. Every stolen kiss, every whispered vow, every moment of closeness carried not only warmth, but also the cold knowledge that discovery would bring ruin. And yet, the risk itself made the love feel undeniable, unstoppable, as if it were the one piece of life that slavery could not crush completely. Because to love in such a place, in such a time, was not merely to feel affection, it was to reclaim, even for a heartbeat, the self that had been stolen. It was to say, I am still human. I am still mine. I can still give and receive love, even when the world tells me I cannot. And though the cabins were filled with silence, though the fields stretched endless and unforgiving, these hidden relationships glowed quietly, like embers shielded by careful hands, fragile yet persistent, waiting, always waiting, for the night to shelter them again. When suspicion hardened into accusation, and accusation swelled into punishment, the process did not unfold in silence or secrecy. On the plantation, discipline was never private. It was theatre. A performance staged with cruel precision meant not only to break the bodies of the accused, but also to burn the memory of their suffering into the minds of all who watched. At dawn, long before the sun had risen high enough to soften the air, the enslaved were ordered from their cabins and driven to a clearing. Children clung to their mothers, too young to understand, yet old enough to feel the heaviness pressing down on the crowd. Men lowered their eyes, for to look directly was dangerous, but to look away entirely was impossible. Women whispered prayers under their breath, the words trembling but steady, as though even God needed to be reminded that there was still humanity among the condemned. At the centre of the clearing, the accused stood, their bodies already weakened by nights without sleep, by beatings administered before the spectacle began, by the unbearable weight of being singled out. They knew, as did everyone, that the outcome was decided long before this morning. The gathering was not trial, but sentence, not justice, but warning. The overseer began with words about sin, about unnatural acts, about rebellion against order. Yet the words were less important than the whip he held coiled in his hand, the noose hanging ready from a branch overhead, the way the master sat in silence, a figure of distant authority, while his will was carried out by others. The lash fell first, its crack sharp enough to slice the morning air. It tore skin, drew blood, and silenced the crowd into a stillness more profound than any prayer. Each strike was not only pain delivered to flesh, but also fear hammered into the hearts of those watching, a reminder that what they witnessed could, with the smallest misstep, become their own fate. If the lash was deemed insufficient, the ritual deepened. The rope, swaying lightly in the breeze, was brought forward. The condemned, sometimes barely able to stand, was forced onto a stool or wagon. The noose slipped tight around the neck, the overseer's hand steady as if he were conducting not violence but ceremony. And in that unbearable pause before the stool was kicked or the wagon rolled away, the condemned would search the crowd, sometimes locking eyes with the one they had loved, forced to watch, broken by grief, punished not only by loss but by the knowledge that love itself had been transformed into death. When the body fell, silence swept across the clearing. It was not the silence of peace, but of suffocation, of fear so thick it clung to every breath. The children cried quietly. Mothers hushed them with trembling hands. Men stared at the ground as though the earth itself might open and hide them. The overseer announced that order had been restored, that the lesson was clear, that the system had once again proven itself unshakable. But within the hearts of those who had been forced to watch, another truth burned quietly. They understood that what had been punished was not laziness, nor rebellion, nor even sin, but love, something that belonged to them, something no whip or rope could erase entirely. And though fear pressed heavily upon them, though silence was demanded, the memory of that love, however brief, however doomed, would linger in the songs they sang at night, in the stories they whispered to each other, in the very way they looked at one another when the overseer's back was turned. The punishment was meant to end love. Instead, it proved that love had existed, that it had been powerful enough to threaten even the strongest chains. When the clearing emptied, and the crowd was driven back to the fields, when the body was taken down and the overseer's whip coiled once more at his side, those in power believed the matter had ended. They thought fear would erase memory, that silence would erase truth, that no trace of forbidden love could survive beyond the spectacle of punishment. But memory has ways of hiding itself, of slipping through the cracks of oppression, of disguising truth in forms too subtle for the master to notice. In the cabins, after dusk, when the fires burned low and children dozed on their mothers' laps, Songs rose into the night air. To the ears of the overseers, these were work songs, spirituals, hymns of longing for heaven or freedom. But to those who sang them, the words carried layers of meaning, messages of resistance, memories of the dead, fragments of stories that could not be spoken openly. A line about crossing a river might be a prayer for escape. A verse about sorrow might be a remembrance of someone lost, not to illness or age, but to the rope that dangled from a tree. In this way, music became a vessel for memory, carrying love that could not be named safely in words. Stories, too, travelled in whispers, passed from mouth to ear in the quiet of night. A mother might tell her child about two people who cared for one another, about how they were taken, about how they were punished. She would not speak the details plainly. She would wrap them in caution, in warnings, in the soft veil of allegory. But the child would understand enough to remember. And in remembering, the story survived. Even gestures became a kind of code. A glance across a room, a phrase spoken in a tone that only one other could recognize. A carved piece of wood passed secretly from one hand to another. To outsiders, they were nothing, mere scraps, meaningless fragments. But to those who shared them, they were tokens of something larger, reminders that love, though dangerous, still pulsed beneath the surface of silence. The very act of remembering became resistance. Every song sung softly in the dark, every whispered story, every small gesture was a refusal to let cruelty erase humanity. Though the master could command labour, could demand obedience, could punish affection, he could not fully prevent memory from flowing like a hidden current beneath the surface of daily life. And so, even as generations passed, even as slavery gave way to other forms of oppression, the hidden truths lingered. They were never written in ledgers or preserved in the records of the powerful, but they lived on in music, in folklore, in the unspoken understanding that love had existed, had survived, had mattered, even when the world declared it a crime. It was a quiet rebellion, one that left no visible scars on the land, but that carried within it the promise that memory, once kindled, could never be fully extinguished. And so, as our long journey through these fields of sorrow and memory comes gently to its close, let us pause and breathe in the silence that lingers after the story is told. The sun has set, the cabins are dark, the overseer's voice has faded into history, yet the weight of what happened here still presses faintly against the air, like the echo of a song whose words you cannot quite remember, but whose melody still clings to your heart. To be enslaved was to live in a world where everything was owned by another. Your labour, your time, your body, even the very children you brought into the world. And yet, within that world, love still flickered, quietly and defiantly, like a lantern hidden under a cloth. It was fragile, yes, but it was also unyielding, because no whip, no rope, no decree could ever truly claim the heart. The enslavers tried to control it, to punish it, to erase it, but in doing so they proved something they never intended to, that love was strong enough to unsettle even the cruelest system. Tonight, as you lie in your own bed, far removed from the dirt floors and crowded cabins of 2 centuries ago, you might think about how many of those stories were never written down, how many names were lost, how many lives were reduced in ledgers to numbers and property, while the truth of their hearts was carried only in whispers, only in songs, only in memories that had to be hidden. And yet you are here, listening, remembering, keeping alive for a moment the reality of people who dared to love in the darkest of times. History, when told by the powerful, often leaves no room for these tender fragments. It speaks of laws, of battles, of presidents and generals, but rarely of glances stolen in the shadows of a cabin, of hands brushing against each other other in the rows of cotton, of 2 people finding a sliver of joy though they knew the price might be death. And yet, it is precisely these fragments that remind us most clearly of what it means to be human. Not the wars, not the empires, but the quiet insistence of the human heart to beat in rhythm with another, even when the world says it must not. As you drift towards sleep, let the story settle like a gentle weight upon you, not to trouble your dreams, but to remind you that even in the harshest corners of our past, sparks of tenderness and resistance burned. Close your eyes and imagine the songs sung softly in the night, the words carrying double meanings, the melodies carrying hidden griefs and hidden hopes. Imagine the faces of those who dared to love, blurred by time but not erased, still looking toward one another even as chains clattered at their feet. And imagine that, in some small way, by remembering them now, you are part of the chain of memory that they began, a chain not of iron, but of remembrance, stretching forward into the present, into the future. Love, no matter how forbidden, no matter how punished, has always found a way to endure. It survived in whispers, it survived in songs, it survived in memories too stubborn to die. And it survives tonight, in your listening, in your drifting thoughts, in the space between waking and dreaming where history lingers like a candle flickering in the dark. So breathe deeply, let the story fade, let the weight of centuries dissolve into the quiet of your room, and know that even the heaviest chains could not crush completely the simple, eternal truth that the human heart, fragile as it may be, was never meant to live without love. And with that, let sleep take you, softly, slowly, gently, as history once again becomes a dream. Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to the American frontier. Dust, heat, creaky wooden sidewalks, and more tumbleweeds than you can count. The year is somewhere in the 1870s. The town's main street is lined with low-slung buildings, and the air smells faintly of horses' leather and the frying oil from the one cafe in town that somehow manages to burn both coffee and bacon at the same time. You're here for love, or at least some company, but there's one small problem. You're a man looking for another man, and this is the Wild West. Let's just say, subtlety isn't just encouraged, it's essential for survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious. Post your location and local time in the comments. Always fascinates me to see who's drifting off in Sydney and who's listening wide awake in Chicago at 3 a.m. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice about your new home on the frontier is that everyone is looking at you. Sideways glances from women carrying baskets of laundry, slow nods from cowboys lounging against hitching posts, suspicious squints from old-timers playing checkers outside the general store. Out here, a newcomer is either the most exciting thing to happen all month or a problem waiting to happen. And if you're carrying the secret you're carrying, you're already scanning faces for who might be a friend and who might be trouble. You walk down the dusty main street, boots thudding on the packed earth, hat pulled low to shade your eyes. The sun here doesn't just shine, it presses on you like a hot, heavy quilt. Every building seems to leak noise. Piano music from the saloon, the metallic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, children shouting in a mix of English, Spanish, and the occasional Lakota phrase. It's a place where cultures collide, where someone might be wearing a bowler hat, while speaking German to his neighbour in the same breath he uses to yell at his mule. Finding romance here, especially if your type is another man, isn't impossible, but it's like trying to water a cactus without anyone noticing. You've got a watering can. The looks are quick, the smile's small, and there's a whole vocabulary in the way someone adjusts their belt or tips their hat. Historians still argue whether these signals were intentional or just coincidence, but when you're the one taking the risk, you learn to read body language like scripture. You pass a pair of cowhands leaning against a corral fence, their boots scuffed from days of riding. One of them glances at you a second too long. Not enough to draw attention, but just enough that you file it away. Out here, a second glance can be the start of something, or the start of gossip that'll follow you faster than a hungry coyote. There's a strange intimacy to the West's public spaces. The saloon, for example, is the heart of the town, not because it serves the best drinks, it doesn't, but because it's where you can sit in the corner and watch everyone. It's a stage where the cowboys swagger, the miners complain, the gamblers smile too wide, and the women working upstairs drift down now and then like ghosts in lace. If you're clever, you'll notice the way two men will share a drink and laugh a little too close, their knees almost touching under the table. If you're even cleverer, you'll know when to look away so no one catches you noticing. Of course there's danger in every interaction. The Wild West is less yee-haw and more "be careful or you'll get run out of town." Vigilante justice is alive and well, and it doesn't take much for a crowd to decide you don't belong. Newspapers might not print your name, but they'll say enough that everyone knows. And in small towns, everyone always knows. At night, when the dust settles and the last light fades over the horizon, you'll find yourself walking the quieter back streets, lanes lined with weathered fences, and the occasional stray chicken roosting where it shouldn't. This is when the air cools and the stars appear in a sheet so bright it almost hurts your eyes. It's the kind of sky that makes you think about possibility, and also reminds you how alone you are out here. If you're lucky, you'll have arranged a meeting, quick words in passing, a note slipped into your hand at the post office. You'll pick a spot outside of town, maybe near the creek where the cottonwoods grow thick enough to hide two silhouettes. There's a myth that the West was nothing but rough men and danger, but the truth is more complicated. There was gentleness too, a cowboy smoothing the mane of his horse, a rancher knitting a pair of socks on a winter night, a miner singing quietly to himself in a language no one else in camp understood. You learn to find those moments, to tuck them away like keepsakes in your mind, because sometimes those are all you get, and so you walk on, eyes open, steps steady. You know the risks, but you also know the reward, a touch, a word, a shared smile that tells you you're not alone in this vast, dusty expanse. The West may not be ready for you, but it's big enough that somewhere, maybe just over the next ridge, someone is. Cowboy courtship in the Wild West is a funny sort of thing. For starters, there's not a lot of candlelit dinners or love letters pressed in scented envelopes, unless you count eating beans straight from the pot under the stars and carving your initials into the handle of someone's branding iron. Out here, courtship is as much about surviving together as it is about falling in love. And when your interest happens to be in another man, the rules, unwritten as they are, get even trickier. You quickly learn that romance among cowboys is a game of patience and plausible deniability. You might share a blanket during a frigid prairie night, but no one talks about it in the morning. You might accidentally ride alongside the same man on every cattle drive, but that's just because you work well together. Historians still argue whether these habits were born out of necessity or quiet desire, but the people living it didn't need to debate. It was simply how things were done. A cowboy courtship often starts in the most ordinary of ways, tending to a sick horse together, mending the same stretch of fence, or splitting the last biscuit from the chuck wagon. There's a certain intimacy in working side by side for hours without speaking, letting the shared silence say more than words could. In a world where being too forward could get you into trouble, the art was in letting moments linger just long enough to be noticed, but not so long that anyone else noticed. Ranch work itself offered plenty of opportunities for subtle connection. You might help another cowboy lift a saddle, letting your hands brush, accidentally. You might volunteer for the night watch knowing he'd be there too, the two of you swapping stories in low voices while the herd shifted in the darkness. It's a kind of slow burn courtship, measured, cautious, but still charged with something warm beneath the surface. Out on the range, time stretches in a strange way. Days feel endless, but seasons pass in a blink. In that expanse, relationships could deepen quietly, almost invisibly, to the point where no one remembered when two men started always sharing the same pot of coffee or repairing gear together. You became each other's person, no declarations needed, no questions asked. That's not to say it was all quiet longing. Cowboys had their own ways of teasing and testing each other, of sending signals under the guise of harmless banter. A man might accidentally call you by a pet name in front of others, partner or hoss, with just enough warmth to make you wonder if he meant more by it. Or he might offer you the last cup of coffee when everyone else knew he never gave up coffee for anyone. Small gestures became the language of affection, spoken in plain sight, yet understood only by the two of you. Sometimes these rituals extended into the saloons. A shared drink could be more than a drink. It could be a declaration, quiet and dangerous. Sitting side by side at the bar, elbows touching, one man might order the same whiskey as the other every single time, as if aligning tastes meant aligning something more. And if the night was good, if the crowd was loud enough and the poker game distracting enough, a knee might rest just a little closer than usual under the table. But in the West, romance always had to wrestle with practicality. The cattle drive left little room for dreamy afternoons, and ranch chores didn't pause for anyone's fluttering heart. You couldn't openly court someone without drawing attention, so you found other ways. Whittling a small token to leave in his saddlebag, fixing a loose stirrup strap before he noticed it was broken, saving the choicest cut of meat for his plate when cooking over the campfire. Acts of service were safer than words, and sometimes spoke louder. Of course, there was always risk. The wrong joke taken the wrong way could sour a friendship. A gift misread could turn into a problem you couldn't explain away. So you learned to dance the long, slow dance of waiting, always hoping for that one moment when the risk felt worth it. And maybe it would come during a thunderstorm, when you both huddled under the same slicker, rain pounding on the canvas, and realized you were holding on a little tighter than you needed to. The West's vastness meant two things. You could vanish into the horizon, and so could the people you cared for. A man might ride off for a season, or forever, and you'd never know if you'd see him again. That's why the cowboys who dared to care for each other cherished every moment. Every shared cup of coffee, every ride side by side, every quiet glance across a campfire was a small act of defiance in a world that had no place for what you felt. And so, courtship in the Wild West wasn't about grand gestures or public declarations. It was about surviving long enough to steal another moment, to find another excuse to linger, to make sure your stories intertwined in ways no one else would notice. Because sometimes, in the dust and danger of the frontier, the smallest moments were the biggest victories. The saloon is the beating, slightly tipsy heart of any frontier town. From the outside, it's just another false front building with swinging batwing doors and a faded sign promising fine liquors in hand-painted letters. But step inside, and you're stepping into a whole different world. A world where people talk too loud, gamble too much, and sometimes, if you know how to look, flirt in ways that would scandalize the church ladies across the street. By day, the saloon belongs to the regulars. Miners with dust in their beards, cowboys looking to spend their pay, the occasional travelling salesman in a bowler hat. The air smells of whiskey, stale beer, and the faint tang of cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. The piano in the corner is always a little out of tune, and the player never quite remembers the same tempo twice. In the daylight hours, it's easy to blend in. You can nurse a drink and swap harmless stories, learning the lay of the land without anyone suspecting you're looking for something beyond a card game. But it's at night when the saloon takes on its double life. Once the sun dips behind the horizon and lanterns are lit, the place hums with a different energy. The music gets louder, the laughter looser, and the shadows in the corners seem to grow deeper, perfect for conversations that don't need an audience. Historians still argue whether saloons knowingly acted as safe meeting spots for queer men, or if it was just a happy accident of dim lighting and enough noise to cover a whisper. Either way, for men like you, the saloon could be a lifeline. There are certain tables, always near the back where the lamplight doesn't quite reach, that are unofficially taken most nights. The men sitting there keep their voices low, but their eyes are busy. They know how to read each other, to catch the small, almost invisible nod that says, "Yes, I see you too." Sometimes it's nothing more than a smile held a beat too long before one man stands and leaves, knowing the other will follow 10 minutes later. The staff, of course, notice everything. The bartender knows who orders the same drink every time, who lingers long after their friends have gone, who always seems to bump into the same man week after week. Some bartenders pretend not to notice. Others give a warning glance if they think the wrong person is paying too much attention. And then there are the rare ones, usually older, wiser, who quietly keep your secrets safe, because they understand that a man's business is his own. If you want to meet someone in a saloon, there's a kind of unspoken choreography. First, you find a spot that doesn't draw too much attention, never the bar itself, too exposed, and never too close to the poker table, where tempers flare. You choose a table with a good view of the room but a solid wall at your back. Then you wait. You sip your drink, slowly. You glance up just often enough to catch someone's eye without making it obvious. Sometimes nothing happens at all, and you go home with nothing but the smell of smoke in your clothes. Other nights, though, the air feels different, charged, expectant. If you're lucky, you'll end up next to someone at the bar who strikes up a conversation. It'll start with something safe, cattle prices, the weather, the sorry state of the coffee at the boarding house. But underneath, there's an edge, a testing of waters. If the conversation lingers past the point where it should, if he offers to buy you another drink when yours is still half full, you might just be in luck. Of course, luck in the Wild West always comes with risk. The same noise and shadows that protect you can also hide someone with less than friendly intentions. A joke taken the wrong way, a hand resting too long on an arm, these things could turn the room cold in an instant. That's why discretion isn't just a courtesy here, it's survival. You learn to leave separately, to take different routes out, to make sure no one sees where you're headed. Yet for all its danger, the saloon offers something rare, a place where you can see and be seen, even if only for a moment. In the clink of glasses and the murmur of voices, in the warm press of a crowd where no one is paying too much attention, there's a freedom you can't find under the open sky. It's fleeting, yes, but in the West, fleeting moments are often the only ones you get. And sometimes they're enough to keep you going until the next Friday night, when the music starts up again and the shadows in the corners start to feel like home. Out here, the danger isn't a dusty duel at high noon. It's a whisper, a sideways glance, a question that lingers just a little too long. In the Wild West, discovery wasn't some romantic notion of being found out in a moment of candlelit drama. It was the kind of discovery that could ruin you before you even finished your drink. The law was one thing. The books themselves in most territories didn't have neatly labelled anti-gay statutes, the way modern folks might imagine. But that didn't mean you were safe. Sodomy laws, vague, severe, and enforced at whim, could land a man in prison for years, with the added bonus of a reputation that would follow him forever. In practice, though, it was often the court of public opinion, or the local sheriff's sense of morality that decided your fate. Historians still argue whether certain lawmen turned a blind eye because they genuinely didn't care, or because they preferred to keep people under the quiet threat of scandal. Then there was vigilante justice, quick, merciless, and entirely outside the law. A man suspected of unnatural behaviour could be run out of town in the dead of night, his possessions dumped in the street, his horse untied and left to wander. In harsher cases, the mob didn't wait for morning. And here's the thing, a mob didn't have to be big to be dangerous. In a settlement of 60 people, 3 men with rifles could decide your entire future. It didn't take much to get tongues wagging. Spend too much time with the same person. Be seen walking home together after dark. Decline the attention of the opposite sex too consistently. Sometimes even the wrong hobbies could paint a target on your back. A cowboy who liked to sew, a ranch hand who kept his beard too tidy. Small, harmless quirks in most places. But out here, they could be twisted into proof if someone had it in for you. The real trick was learning to live in plain sight. You didn't hide, you blended. You might keep your voice a little louder in the saloon so no one thought you were whispering secrets. You might join the poker game even if you hated cards, just to be one of the boys. You might tip your hat to the school teacher in public, even if you weren't courting her, just so people had a story they could believe. Some men took on what today we might call beards, relationships or even marriages with women who either didn't know or quietly didn't care. Others built elaborate cover stories, claiming a restless nature to explain why they never settled down, moving from job to job, town to town, before the rumour mill had time to warm up. The thing about gossip in the West is that it spread faster than a prairie fire, and it burned just as hot. One innuendo, one wrong joke overheard, and suddenly you'd notice people stepping aside when you walked into a store, conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Landlords could refuse you a room. Employers could find a reason to let you go. And unlike back east, there was no sympathetic city neighbourhood you could melt into, just miles of open land and another town where you'd have to start all over again. Even those rare connections you made had to be treated like a shared secret map. A meeting at night might require days of planning, making sure neither of you was followed, choosing a spot far enough from prying eyes that you could talk without fear. There was always that small, sharp awareness in the back of your mind. What if someone saw? What if someone guessed? Of course, there's an irony to it. The West was built on the idea of personal freedom. Go where you want, do as you please, reinvent yourself in a new town. And yet, when it came to love, especially love that didn't fit the narrow rules of the day. Freedom was the one thing you couldn't quite have. You could ride for days across endless plains without seeing another soul, but you still had to keep your heart on a short leash. The danger of discovery wasn't just in the punishment, it was in the slow erosion of safety. It was in knowing that one person's disapproval could ripple out to the whole town. It was in the fact that even the man you trusted most could, in a single bad moment, decide that self-preservation meant pointing a finger at you instead. So you learned the quiet art of being half known. You left just enough of yourself visible for the world to accept, and kept the rest tucked away like a pocket knife, close at hand, sharp if needed, but never brandished in the open. Out here, survival meant knowing which part of you to show, and which part to keep safely in the shadows. The prairie at night is a strange sort of quiet, not the comforting quiet of a sleepy town, where you can still hear the creak of a rocking chair on a front porch or the distant clink of glasses from a saloon. Out here the quiet is so big it almost has weight. It presses in on you from every direction, broken only by the shuffle of cattle, the low murmur of the wind through dry grass, and maybe, if you're lucky, the quiet crackle of a campfire. You're out on a cattle drive now, miles from the nearest town, nothing around you but stars and the vague outline of the herd spread across the dark prairie. During the day, it's all dust and sun, endless riding and the sharp smell of manure. But at night, when the work slows and the cattle settle, you find yourself face to face with a kind of loneliness that can't be ignored. It's in these long stretches of isolation that bonds between men tend to deepen. You share everything out here: coffee, blankets, the last bit of jerky. You see each other at your worst, wet, cold, hungry, sunburnt, with hats pulled low over eyes trying to steal a few minutes of sleep before your watch starts again. And sometimes, in the middle of that exhaustion, you find a kind of comfort in another man's presence that goes beyond friendship, even if neither of you says so out loud. Historians still debate whether same-sex intimacy among cowboys was common or just a rare, quiet undercurrent. But ask anyone who's ever spent weeks on the open range with the same group of men, and they'll tell you, life out here gets, personal. Not in the dramatic way dime novels like to tell it, but in the small moments, when your shoulders brush as you both reach for the coffee pot, when you share a cigarette under a blanket of stars, when you laugh together about nothing at all just to keep the cold at bay. The campfire becomes the center of this little universe. You sit close, letting the heat warm your boots while sparks drift up into the night. The firelight softens everyone's face, turning even the roughest cowhand into a figure you might imagine in a painting, hat tipped back, eyes reflecting the flames, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. If you're bold, you might sit just a little nearer to the man you've been noticing all week. Not so close that anyone could point it out, but close enough that your knees almost touch. There's an intimacy in conversation too. Talk on the prairie isn't about the weather, that's obvious just by looking up. Instead, it drifts into stories from home, memories of old sweethearts, some of them conspicuously vague on the details, dreams about buying land or starting a business. Sometimes, when the others have wandered off to their bedrolls, the conversation narrows to just the two of you. That's when truths slip out, softly, cautiously, as if the stars themselves might overhear. But this closeness comes with its own dangers. A moment that feels private in the dark can feel exposed in the daylight. The man you shared a blanket with might not meet your eyes the next morning, afraid of what others might think. The camaraderie of night can vanish under the harsh sun, replaced by the usual rhythm of work and distance. Out here, feelings live on a kind of unspoken schedule. They're allowed after sunset, but must be tucked away by dawn. Still, there are moments you can't forget. That night when a storm rolled in and the two of you huddled under the same oilskin, rain pounding on the canvas above you. That quiet hour before dawn when you both stayed awake, not because you had to, but because the silence between you felt too good to break. These moments don't belong to anyone else. They're small, private treasures, locked away in memory where no gossip or law can reach them. And maybe that's the strange gift of lonely prairie nights. They strip everything else away. Out here there are no walls, no disguises, no townfolk watching from behind curtains. Just the open land, the stars, and whoever's sitting next to you. The risk is still there, always, but so is the rare chance to let your guard down, even if only for a few hours. When morning comes, you'll put the distance back between you, mount up, and ride toward the horizon as if nothing happened. But you'll carry the memory with you, folded neatly into your mind like a letter you'll never send. Out here, that's as close to love as most men will ever get. Out on the frontier, saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could end your whole story before the next sunrise. That's why the men who sought each other in the Wild West often developed an art form out of speaking without really saying anything at all. You learn to live in layers. What you say for the world, and what you mean for the one person who understands you. In the towns along the rail lines and cattle routes, there was a subtle vocabulary, gestures, phrases, even clothing choices that could pass unnoticed by most, yet carry a meaning as clear as daylight to those in the know. A certain way of tipping your hat when passing another man, for instance, could be nothing to most folks, or it could be an invitation. Historians still argue whether such codes were formally agreed upon, or simply evolved naturally from caution and necessity. But for the men who used them, the effect was the same, a quiet lifeline in a dangerous world. Sometimes the signals were buried in plain speech. A cowboy might say he was looking for a dance partner when there wasn't a dance hall for miles, and the other man would nod, understanding exactly what was meant. In the saloon, ordering a certain drink or asking for it in an unusual way could serve as a subtle probe, and if you didn't get the answer you wanted, you could shrug it off as nothing. No harm done, no one the wiser. Letters were trickier. The postal service out west was a mix of miraculous and chaotic. Letters could arrive in a few days, or vanish forever if the wrong stagecoach got stuck in a river. If you dared to put feelings on paper, you had to bury them under the kind of language that could survive being read aloud by a curious postmaster. One technique was the safe subject letter, a note about cattle prices or weather patterns, full of seemingly dull details that hid its true meaning in the phrasing. Maybe every third word spelled out something if read in sequence. Maybe the first letters of each sentence formed a name. A more daring approach was to weave in poetry, just enough sentiment that the recipient knew, but vague enough to be explained away as borrowing from a book. Sometimes men entrusted letters to travelling companions, cowhands, peddlers, railroad men, people who could deliver them by hand. This was risky too. A letter could be read, lost, or deliberately destroyed. But when the only other option was silence, it was a risk some were willing to take. Not all communication was written. In the boarding houses that dotted the frontier towns, shared spaces made for both opportunity and danger. You might leave a sign, a scarf hung in a particular way, a deck of cards left in a specific order that only one person would understand. A favourite trick was to slip a small token, like a button or coin, into someone's boot while they were out working. Finding it later was the signal to meet in a pre-arranged place. The code was as much about timing as it was about content. A meeting might be suggested in a glance across a dusty street at noon, but not carried out until midnight, when the streets were empty. And because you never knew who might be watching, you learned to move separately, taking long, meandering routes that looked like aimless wandering, but brought you to the same spot at the same time. The strange thing is, living this way gave certain relationships a kind of heightened intensity. When you can't say what you mean, you learn to read everything, the way a man leans against a post, the way he lingers over a word. The smallest confirmation, a smile that you know wasn't meant for anyone else, becomes enough to carry you for days. Of course, mistakes could be costly. A poorly chosen phrase, overheard by someone suspicious, could start the slow spread of gossip. A letter that fell into the wrong hands could put both sender and recipient at risk. That's why so many of these codes were ephemeral, spoken once and never repeated, written only to be burned after reading. Even so, the effort was worth it. Out here, where distances were measured in days of hard riding and privacy was a rare luxury, having even one person you could speak to, really speak to, was worth more than gold dust. And if it took a secret handshake, a crooked smile, and a letter no one else could understand to make that connection, well, it was still a better gamble than most poker hands played in the West. Boarding houses in the Wild West were strange little worlds unto themselves, half hotel, half home, and entirely dependent on the personality of whoever ran them. If you were a cowboy between cattle drives, a miner waiting on the next strike, or a shop clerk without a family house in town, the boarding house was where you hung your hat. For some, it was just a bed and a plate of beans. For others, particularly men like you, it was both an opportunity and a gamble. Picture it. Narrow hallways lined with mismatched doors, each one opening onto a room barely wide enough for a bed, a chair, and a washstand. The wallpaper is peeling in spots. The floors creak so loudly, you could map the night movements of every guest by sound alone, and the smell is a blend of kerosene lamps, laundry soap, and whatever the cook managed to burn for supper. Privacy? Not exactly. But proximity? Oh, plenty of that. In many smaller towns, beds were a commodity. More cowhands and drifters came through than there were rooms to hold them. Doubling up wasn't unusual. If you arrived late or during a busy spell, you might find yourself assigned to share a bed with another man. A practical decision nobody thought twice about. Publicly, at least. In reality, this arrangement could lead to nights where the line between necessity and something warmer blurred just enough to make you wonder where you stood, come morning. Historians still debate how much of this bed-sharing culture led to intimacy, but one thing is certain. It was fertile ground for quiet connections. You couldn't openly court someone in the common dining room, but you could exchange whispers under the cover of darkness, your words muffled by the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. Even the accidental bump of knees beneath the thin quilt could feel like a spark when you were both awake but pretending to sleep. Still, every boarding house had its unofficial rules, and the person enforcing them was usually the landlady. She was the eye that never blinked, the ear that caught every unusual sound from the rooms upstairs. Some were strict, convinced it was their duty to keep a moral house. Others were pragmatic. As long as rent was paid and fights were avoided, they didn't much care what went on behind closed doors. The rarest were the sympathetic ones, often women who'd seen enough of the world to understand that people's lives weren't always what they seemed. Common spaces provided their own risks and rewards. Meals were taken together at long, scarred tables, the air thick with the smell of stew and the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. A man might pass you the bread with a smile that meant something more, or he might avoid your eyes completely after an unguarded moment upstairs the night before. In the evenings, there was often a shared parlour where guests sat by the fire, read newspapers, or played cards. It was a place to test the waters with a joke or a lingering glance, but always carefully, always aware that gossip could travel faster than the scent of fresh coffee in the morning. Sometimes the boarding house itself became part of the cover story. Two men could rent adjoining rooms and visit back and forth under the pretense of borrowing tobacco or discussing cattle prices. Others might arrange their arrivals and departures so they were seen together often enough to be considered friends, but never so often that anyone suspected more. But the gamble was always there. One careless word in the hallway, one door left ajar, one guest with too much whiskey in him, and a need to stir trouble, and suddenly you might find yourself packing your belongings in the middle of the night. Towns were small, and news spread fast. A bad rumour in one boarding house could mean every other place in town was suddenly full the next time you knocked. And yet, for all its risks, the boarding house offered something rare in the West, a kind of enforced closeness. In a place where life was hard and connections fleeting, those thin walls and shared beds created moments that might not have been possible anywhere else. Maybe it was the smell of someone's soap on the pillow you shared. Maybe it was the whispered conversation after the lamps went out, voices low enough that only the other could hear. Whatever it was, those moments mattered. They were the kind of memories you carried with you long after you'd ridden out of town, folded away like a letter you could never mail. If the West had one unspoken rule, it was this. You could be anything you wanted, as long as you looked the part. And for some men in love with other men, looking the part meant bending that rule just enough to slip under the radar. Clothing wasn't just about style. It was disguise, a signal, a performance, and sometimes a way of living that felt more natural than anything else. The frontier loved appearances. A rancher's hat said something about his status. A gambler's tailored vest told you he was good with cards, or at least wanted you to think so, and a preacher's black coat was as much a badge as a sheriff's star. And yet, woven into all those outward identities, was the occasional figure who didn't quite match expectations, and sometimes got away with it because no one dared to challenge them. Cross-dressing wasn't entirely unheard of in the Wild West. In fact, some of the most famous examples were women dressing as men to work or travel safely. But there were also men, fewer, quieter, and often less recorded, who wore women's clothing either for entertainment or as part of their daily life. Historians still argue whether certain individuals did so purely for performance or because it aligned more closely with their identity, but the effect was the same. It disrupted expectations, and in the right setting, it provided cover. One of the safer spaces for this kind of expression was the travelling show. Theatre troupes, vaudeville acts, or medicine shows that rolled through dusty towns like moving islands of eccentricity. These shows often had specialty acts featuring cross-dressed performers, and as long as the audience laughed or clapped, no one asked too many questions. For a man who wanted to live outside the rigid norms of the West, a stage costume could be both an escape and a shield. Even off stage, clothing could act as a subtle signal. A certain silk scarf tucked into a vest pocket, a flash of bright colour when most men stuck to dusty browns and blacks. These touches were small, but noticeable to those who paid attention. In some towns, such flourishes were simply chalked up to that city fellow's odd ways, allowing a man to stand out just enough to catch the right kind of eye without drawing dangerous suspicion. Sometimes cross-dressing was less about gender expression and more about cover. There are quiet accounts, half buried in diaries and letters, of men donning women's clothing to visit partners without being recognised. Picture it. A dark night, a borrowed bonnet and shawl, the quick shuffle through back alleys to a boarding house room where someone was waiting. Risky? Absolutely. But in places where discovery could mean ruin, a good disguise was worth the gamble. There were also those who lived respectably by crafting an image that discouraged questions. A man might adopt the air of a bachelor, confirmed by choice, dressing meticulously, carrying himself with dignity, and surrounding himself with respectable acquaintances, often women, who reinforced his public image. Behind that facade, there might be an entirely different private life, conducted carefully and quietly. The great irony was that the West prided itself on individuality, yet certain kinds of individuality had to be hidden in plain sight. If you were clever, you could use the costume of respectability, or the outrageousness of performance, to carve out a space where you could breathe more freely. Some men even found that by leaning into an exaggerated persona, they could distract from the truth, play the role of the harmless eccentric, and people might talk about your odd hats or your fondness for poetry, never suspecting or never admitting they knew more. Of course, none of this was without danger. A disguise that fooled most people might still fail in front of the wrong pair of eyes. A silk scarf could be admired one day and questioned the next. And in the rigid moral climate of many frontier towns, once suspicion took root, it was hard to uproot. Still, for those who couldn't or wouldn't conform, clothing was more than fabric. It was a tool, a language, a way of signalling to the world, "You may not see all of me, but I am here." Whether it was the borrowed dress of a nighttime visit, the painted cheeks of a vaudeville performer, or the polished boots of the lifelong bachelor, each choice of attire was a small act of survival, and sometimes, in its own quiet way, an act of love. If there was one thing that could stir up a sleepy frontier town, it was the arrival of a travelling show. Word would spread like wildfire. Posters slapped up on saloon walls, gossip whispered in the general store, kids darting through the streets announcing the circus or vaudeville troupe was rolling in. For a few days, the dusty rhythms of ranch life and mining shifts would give way to bright lights, loud music, and people who seemed to have come from another planet entirely. For men like you, the arrival of entertainers was more than a diversion. It was a breath of fresh air in a place where the air could get mighty stifling. Travelling shows were full of folks who didn't quite fit into the mould of respectable small-town society. There were actors and acrobats, snake oil salesmen, jugglers, fortune-tellers, and musicians with glittering waistcoats and voices that could fill a tent. They lived by their own rules, drifting from one place to the next, answering to no one except the ringmaster or the theatre manager. And, perhaps most importantly, they tended to carry with them a more relaxed attitude toward love, friendship, and identity. Historians still argue whether this was because of urban influence, artistic temperament, or simply the practicality of living in close quarters with the same troupe for months on end. Whatever the cause, it meant that for a few golden nights the rules that governed the rest of the town seemed to loosen. The performers themselves often knew they were a curiosity. They played to it. Costumes in colours you didn't see on the prairie, makeup that caught the lamplight, a swagger or sway that wouldn't be tolerated in the church pews on Sunday. In this mix there were always a few who carried themselves with a kind of knowing glance, the kind that said, "Yes, I see you," and "Yes, you can trust me." A man might strike up a conversation with a visiting violinist or a stagehand while helping unload props from the wagon. A poker game after the performance could stretch into the small hours, fueled by cheap whiskey and the easy camaraderie of people who didn't care much for the town's judgment. If you were lucky, there might be an invitation to visit the troops' camp on the edge of town, a place where the laughter was louder, the songs a little riskier, and the company more accepting. In many ways, the travelling entertainers operated like a moving safe zone. Within their circle, you could let your guard down, just a little, without worrying as much about prying eyes. There were whispered stories of troop members having long-term companions of the same sex. Relationships kept quiet from outsiders, but perfectly open within the group. And for locals who managed to form a connection during those few days, it was like stepping into another world, one where love wasn't constantly looking over its shoulder. Of course it was fleeting. The wagons would pack up, the tents would come down, and the colourful strangers would vanish down the road, leaving only a scattering of confetti in the dirt. But for some, those brief encounters were enough to keep hope alive. Maybe you'd meet again in another town, another year. Maybe you'd join up with the troupe yourself, trading the steady grind of ranch work for the uncertain freedom of the road. Even if you never saw them again, the memory of those nights could linger like the scent of perfume on a borrowed scarf. The way the firelight caught in someone's eyes, the feeling of being understood without explanation, the rare luxury of speaking freely, all of it became something to revisit in the long, quiet stretches of prairie life. The entertainers reminded you that the West was bigger than the few dusty streets you called home. They proved that there were other ways to live, other places to belong, even if most of them were on wheels. And for a man keeping his heart hidden in the folds of everyday life, that reminder was worth its weight in gold. The Chisholm Trail was less a road and more a moving, dust-choked ribbon of noise and grit, stretching hundreds of miles from Texas into Kansas. You'd ride it for weeks on end, driving thousands of cattle north to the railheads, through river crossings, open prairie, and towns so small you could blink and miss them entirely. It was the lifeblood of the cattle business, and for the men riding herd, it was a kind of rolling world all its own. The trail demanded endurance. Days began before sunrise with the smell of campfire coffee and the sound of cowbells, and they ended long after the light had faded, your legs aching from the saddle. The herd moved slow, but the work never stopped, keeping stragglers in line, watching for rustlers, scouting ahead for water. And yet, in the midst of all this hard labour, bonds were forged in ways that life back in town rarely allowed. When you're on the trail, you live side by side with the same handful of men for weeks. You eat together, sleep near each other, take turns on night watch under skies so bright with stars they seem almost unreal. Historians still argue how much of the deep camaraderie among cowhands was purely brotherhood, and how much sometimes crossed the line into quiet romance. But anyone who spent night after night riding alongside the same man, sharing stories, jokes, and the occasional silence that doesn't feel awkward, knows how easily those lines can blur. Campfires on the trail were small, just enough to heat coffee and beans, but they had a way of drawing men close. You'd sit with your knees almost touching, boots propped on the same rock, the orange light painting your faces and flickering in your eyes. A hand passing you a tin cup might linger for just a moment longer than necessary. And because the prairie was vast and empty around you, that tiny space you shared by the fire felt like a private room. There was a certain kind of intimacy in the chores too, helping each other lift heavy saddles, checking gear for wear, patching a friend's torn shirt in the few spare minutes before bed. These were the small acts that kept the trail moving, but they also became quiet gestures of care, things you did without words because words could make them dangerous. On the Chisholm Trail, the nights could be long and lonely, but they were also when the guardrails of normal life loosened. Out there, away from town gossip and the sharp eyes of neighbours, you could laugh a little louder, sit a little closer, and if something more than friendship passed between two men, the prairie swallowed the evidence whole. Still, there were risks. A careless remark overheard during night watch, a gesture noticed by someone looking for trouble. It didn't take much to turn a friend into an enemy. So, discretion was as much a part of trail life as your lariat and your boots. You learned how to be near without being obvious, how to carve out little moments in a schedule ruled by the herd's slow, relentless pace. Sometimes, the trail even became the setting for something that lasted. There are scattered, half-buried accounts of cowhands who, after a drive, stuck together, taking jobs on the same ranch, sharing a bunkhouse, building a life in plain sight as partners. To most folks, they were just two reliable men who worked well together, but they knew different. And then there were the goodbyes, standing by your horse at dawn as the man you'd spent weeks with rode off toward a different rail town, tipping his hat in a way that meant more than any handshake. You'd watch until he disappeared into the haze, and then you'd turn your horse toward whatever came next, carrying the memory of his laugh, the sound of his boots on the trail, and the way the stars looked on the nights when it was just the two of you keeping watch. The Chisholm Trail was hard, dirty, and exhausting, but for some it was also the one place where the vastness of the land gave them just enough room to be themselves, even if only in stolen moments. Every town in the West had its lawman, or claimed to. Sometimes it was a sheriff with an actual badge and a proper jail. Sometimes it was just the biggest man with a revolver, and enough respect to keep order. Whatever their background, former Texas Ranger, Civil War veteran, or just someone with a steady aim, the lawman was the figure everyone measured themselves against. If you were a man with a secret in your heart, the sheriff's opinion mattered more than most. He didn't have to like you, but if he decided to keep you in his good graces, life could be a lot easier. And if he decided otherwise, well, you might find yourself on the next stagecoach out of town. Some lawmen saw everything and pretended they didn't. They knew which men shared a room at the boarding house, who lingered too long at the saloon tables, who met under the cottonwoods by the creek after dark. But maybe they'd served alongside men in the war who'd carried similar secrets. Maybe they'd learned that in a town full of gamblers, outlaws and liars, two men quietly keeping company wasn't the worst problem to have. These sheriffs had a way of looking right through you, squinting against the sun as if to say, "I know more than I'll ever tell." They'd nod once, slow, and then turn away, leaving you with the sense that you'd been measured and, at least for now, not found wanting. Sometimes their silence was a kind of unspoken pact. Keep it discreet, keep it out of trouble, and you can stay. Others, though, weren't so kind. A rumour could be enough for them to make your life difficult. A sudden inspection of your lodging, a conveniently timed, random search, a pointed question asked in front of the wrong crowd. It was a reminder that the law wasn't just about what was written down. It was about who enforced it, and how. For the lucky ones, a lawman's blind eye could mean years of living quietly, building a life with someone in a place where that should have been impossible. For others, it was a temporary reprieve, one that could vanish the moment a new sheriff took over, or the political winds shifted. And so, you learned to read not just the townsfolk, but the man with the badge. You learned when to tip your hat, when to disappear down a side street, and when to stand your ground without saying a word. Because in the Wild West, the line between safety and danger could be as thin as a glance, and sometimes all that kept you on the right side of it was a lawman who decided, for his own reasons, not to see you at all. The prairie wind still blows across those old towns, carrying the echoes of bootsteps, laughter, and the quiet, careful lives of men who loved each other in a place that wasn't ready for them. The lawmen, the cowhands, the entertainers, the ranchers, they've all faded into the dust. But if you listen closely in the hush of a summer night, or the creak of an old saloon door, you might just hear their stories still, soft and steady like a heartbeat that refuses to fade.